I wanted to start off today with a conversation with one of my good friends and colleagues, Dale Dougherty. Over the past year, Dale and I have actually talked more than we ever have. A positive benefit of this pandemic is that a lot of, your organizations have grown closer together, but so have our organizations. What I would call our meta maker organizations, myself, at Nation of Makers, Dale at Make Community, and even Sherry Lassiter at Fab Foundation. I know I've collaborated with all of them a lot more because in times of need and stress, we come together. That's one of the things that we do as makers, and I'm really proud of it. So anyway, Dale and I thought it would be really good. NomCon is one of our opportunities to come together and talk about where we think the movement is going and where we can make a difference. And so Dale and I wanted to come together and have one of our chats that we have often by ourselves in front of everybody else and get some input and just talk.
Yeah.
So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dale Dougherty, who you all know very well. So I don't need to give him a long introduction except to say that he's definitely one of the founders of the maker movement and just one of my dear friends. And I'm so glad to have this
Yeah.
conversation with him. So we'll be
Yeah.
talking a little bit about the future of the maker movement as we see it.
Yeah. Hey, thank you, Dorothy. It's really nice to be here. And, we did have an opportunity to kind of work together more closely to bring people together over the last 15 months or so. So it's great to see everybody here in the audience or so. But you're really not in the audience. You're like we're in a circle around a table, I guess, and we hope to engage you as well. But in some ways, it feels to me, as we talked a little bit before this, there's a time to think about moving forward, or both recognizing what's happened, especially in the last year, but to think about what did we learn from that, and what can we build on, both in terms of this, and I think a few years ago at NomCon in Tennessee, I think I gave a talk about, like in a sense, is the maker movement dead, kind of thing, and that periodically arises. I was on a recent hardware con talk, and there were a couple people grumbling, the maker movement didn't do what we thought it would, and I think it's over. And I kind of said, you just don't see it, as clearly. There's a lot going on, and I think we have to all be a little bit intentional about telling a story about what's happening, that is about, to some degree, us, but about the larger community and some of the things that we can do. And so one of the places I thought we might start our conversation is just recognizing a lot of the good efforts that happened over the last 15 months or so, when COVID. I started writing about it under this Plan C framework that our government might be Plan A, and it was kind of fumbling the response to COVID-19. Industry might be Plan B, but it certainly didn't seem to step up. And what we saw was a civic response, almost represented by the makers, but not just the maker community. There were other civic efforts as well. But my concern is the maker community, and we began organizing programs, Dorothy and I, to talk to people and learn about what was going on. And and today I just sort of want to mention a few of them and recognize them. And there were so many, right? I mean, we probably did 40 programs or so on that, Dorothy. But I think some of the reason I want to mention some, and I don't mean to leave others out, is just I thought we learned a lot from people about what they were doing. And I wanted to kind of give initial shout out to like Artisans Asylum in Somerville, Massachusetts, with Lars Hasselblad Torres, Sarah Miller, and Tim Butterworth. There are three of the many people there. But I remember Lars telling me, we had to decide as a group what we wanted to do and then do it. We couldn't just be a bunch of individual efforts. And it really struck me that that was kind of an important moment of like redefining what a makerspace is. It's not just a workspace where everybody has their own project, but it can be a place where people collaborate and come together and think about, we could do this if we all put it together. And of course, we also learned that few of the makers had any medical background, or necessarily even connections to the medical community, but they they worked through that,
Yeah.
and it didn't stop them. I think of Sarah Miller, in particular, in there, where she really began designing surgical gown or hospital gowns, getting fabric, and they were running 3 shifts a day,
Hmm.
becoming a production facility. Now, nobody thought they wanted to do this full time forever, but this is what the demand was, or the need was, and they stepped up to do that. And lastly, in Arts Inside, Tim Butterworth, I really like his story. He built a device, a 3D printed device that could fold masks and fold the fabric. And then he began working with manufacturers who could make the mask, but they couldn't fold it. They didn't have a machine to fold it. So it was tooling. It was just another way that makers stepped up to do this. So that they're kind of an example of really a sophisticated makerspace doing really great work.
Yeah.
Dorothy, did any ones that come to
Yeah,
your
no, and
mind?
I was thinking when you were talking about, just wanting to make a difference, I was thinking actually about Something Labs and then their name,
Right,
and then the fact that it came out of the idea of like, we have to do something. And,
exactly.
we have to figure that out together. And just thinking even how they came together and the fact that they're all kind of like roommates and friends
Yeah,
from sort of different places, like a hodgepodge of people that didn't even consider themselves makers in many cases, right? But we're like, we can't just sit around and watch people around us die or get sick. We need to do something. And I think that that's the call that we have, deep down inside. We talk so much about how much of making is being human and how much of humanity is tied up in making, and how much, we've been doing this since the beginning of time. We often say that, we often speak to that, we often speak to the agency that kids feel, or the fact that all of us are driven to make something for some reason. And I think a lot of it is in response to something, right? Like there's something that tells us, I have to solve this problem, and you feel kind of compelled, to do something. And so, I mean, that particular story of Something Labs and just the way that they all came together.
yeah,
And then, similarly to your point around Artisans Asylum, I think, these complex relationships that were built between community members and even people outside of a local community, like a larger geographic region, that were like, okay, well, you have space that you're not using, but I need the space. Can I use your space? And then there was, relationships between, manufacturers that were making totally different things. And so they had no clue how to make the new widget or thing, right? Or make the new mask or the face shield. And so, just providing the designs, right? And getting those designs to those folks that needed it, so
yeah,
that they can then ramp up production, because they were used to ramping up production, but they just didn't know how to do it. And I just think that there's a lot of complex pieces of how makers fit in, and not only in the typical way of just making things, but the actual designs and the coordination and the resource sharing, that really shows how integral, these organizations and these individuals are to their communities, right? And
yeah.
I think the beautiful thing is that, looking at folks, especially those folks at Something Labs, again, those are folks that didn't really consider themselves necessarily engineers or makers or designers. Several of them were just like, oh, I happen to be the roommate of this person or the spouse of this person, right? And if you think about, Ada,
Yeah,
like, she's like, I'm just here, and I want to help out, and I have this skill
yeah,
set. And then you look at those
yeah.
folks, and they also went in, a lot of them actually went into health careers afterwards, right? So
It's interesting that I saw as a pattern was there was a group that were doing making and some designing, but a lot of it on the production end. But you needed other skill sets,
mhm,
and the really good groups brought other people in. I
mhm,
always think of the Tana Mask folks.
Yeah.
You know, there was a doctor and a dentist and the dentist's son that developed the mask, but it was a whole other group of people who said, "How can we help?" And
Hmm.
we'll help get it out there. And they formed, like statewide chapters and different groups. But it was people that knew nothing about 3D printing,
Hmm.
that knew nothing about the medical problem, but they kind of got the organizational part. Uh,
Right.
and that it was two women that were wives of military had military spouses, and they just saw them on Facebook and said, I think we could help them, and they did. And so it just, those connections to the community were so important, reaching out beyond the folks we knew. I think another example was in Chicago, that I wrote about was how the makerspace closed at DePaul University, but they
Mhm.
quickly came together to take the 3D printers home, and they set up their own operations so they could make face shields. But then they had to figure out how to distribute them. And someone else who's like a physics professor at DePaul, was involved with the bicycle community, and they use bicycle messengers to distribute the face shields. And they couldn't take them directly to the hospital. The hospital was refusing them. So they figured out where the doctors lived, and they talked to them, and they delivered it to their homes. So they walked into the hospital with the face shields and then passed them out to their colleagues. So just really clever, creative ways to you could really see communities of networks, and it wasn't just the maker network that was important. It was the health professional network. It was but often these were not institutional networks. They were like bike messengers. It's just, hey, it's a group. It's a group of people that get together and do different things.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, the reality is we are part of a larger community, right? Like, so each one of us
Right.
occupies a geographic region or an area or community. And we also have overlapping Venn diagrams of communities, right? So some of us may be bicycle messengers and also makers, right? Some of us
Yeah.
may be chefs and also makers. And, you
Exactly.
know, and so I think, when you have to use everything, right? Because everything is needed and everyone's talent is needed, I think you start to really figure out, how do I fit in and where can my talents be best used? And I know that sounds a little, like, okay, it's a little wavy there,
Yeah.
but I think that the reality is that we each occupy, like we have these talents that we're given.
Yeah.
And
Just I'm sorry. Go
oh, no, no, it's okay. I was just going to say, like,
on.
and then it just, and I mean, it grows. And so I think that the more people that the more that you're able to use those skills and talents, and the more you're able to get new skills and talents, and it just kind of keeps feeding upon one another. And so
Right.
I think COVID gave us this incredible problem set that we had never seen before. And it literally was like every single one of us had a piece of the jigsaw puzzle, and all of us stood to benefit. I think very
Right.
rarely, sometimes we have these disasters or things that happen and they're very localized. And so it's really easy to turn off the news and say, well, oh, it's so sad for those people over there. But this was the first time that all of us were facing something
Yeah.
exactly at the same time. And I think there was no over there. It's here,
Yeah.
it's there,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
everywhere.
Yeah.
So I think that that's really a lot of it. Sorry to
Yeah.
cut you off.
No, no, that's fine. I was just going to mention that, there are examples like Sam worked the Exploratorium, and he was
Mhm.
out of work because they closed.
Right.
And he said, well, we got to do something. But another example was the LA Public Library was closed. And V. Ha, who runs the makerspace there, I think she was just an inspiring person to get to know in this. But they began figuring out how to go out into the community. If people couldn't come to them, they had to kind of flip the script and take kits and organize things for people in the community. So we had a lot of really good stories like that. Another I wanted to mention was Karina Popovich, who started Makers for COVID-19, and now I think it's morphed into Makers for Change. But this was if you want to feel good about something, this is somebody who her and her group of, or cohort, if you will, at is it Bedford Stuyvesant
Yeah. Yeah.
in New York. They learned 3D printing because there was a makerspace there, and when they saw She had, gone, I think was a freshman at Cornell when this came out, and she was at home. When they saw there was a need for makers to get together and make PPE, she organized a group. And, this is probably a 19-year-old or so
Mhm.
herself. And just an impressive person. I was so proud to see that someone like her was trying to meet the needs. And they focused, I think, on like bus drivers. It
Mhm.
wasn't just the medical community. They said there's other people that are kind of kind of have to respond to this, and nobody's providing them with PPE. So just amazing groups of people that came together. And kind of lastly, maybe to just mention the big I think success really was Guy Cavalcanti starting open source medical supplies, and people like Sabrina Merlot and Victoria Jacqua and many, many, many others coming together to do the coordination among groups. And I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned there that, that you need some kind of integrating functions that help connect organizations without taking over their mission or doing it for them. So I think a really big shout out to them. And Dorothy, a big shout out to you too, because I think, well, you did a lot of things behind the scenes to bring organizations and maker spaces together. So, we sometimes will focus on the frontline worker,
Mhm.
but there's a group of people that actually focused on how do we connect groups, how do we connect maker spaces to funding or
Mhm.
to what was it? One of the examples was materials,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
lack of materials to be able to produce things. So this is, I think, just the reason we wanted to start on this is to really celebrate this in our community
Mhm.
and say, look at this. Maybe everybody in the world doesn't know this, but we should know this, and we should really remember it and learn from it.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that reality is the thing that I really am trying to take away. And I think most of us, I've had so many conversations. I don't think we're yet post COVID. I mean, we have all these new variants that are coming out. So unfortunately, we're not quite there yet. But as we get to the tail end of COVID, I think, we're realizing that what happened was unprecedented in terms of, obviously the pandemic itself, but certainly in terms of, our response and the way that we all came together. And I think, one of the things that, I push in, again, this conference, one of the things that we do every year is come together, not just to say, we're so amazing, but to really think about like what we've done and how we can use that in the future. Right. So, I think that the theme of this conference was around resilience, and how do we take those local communities that have done such amazing work and that are continuing to do amazing work on the local level and scale it up, right, to sort of a much larger national sort of impact. Now we saw this already happen with COVID, and I think one of the things that we're trying to understand, and part of why I was excited to have this conversation, is really to think about, you know we did that, we're super grateful that we did that, but what can we take out of that, right? Like, what are the things that we need? And as we talk and advocate, one of the things we've been trying to do is advocate not just to the federal government, but also local governments, other decision makers and policymakers. What are the points that we need them to understand? How can they give us support in a way that will allow this movement and what we did,
Right,
right, to go farther? So,
right,
I think some of the things that were really key, like you said, was this idea of how do we communicate with one another? There do need to be entities. And, I'm proud that Nation of Makers is one of those entities that brings people together. There need to be entities like that. But there also does, you're right, there needs to be support for funding. I think some of the things that were challenging is that our organizations that were doing this work for a long period, way too long during the pandemic, they were doing it all for free. They used up every single supply they had because they wanted to help everyone around
right.
them. And it's crazy. So you think about, like, okay, well, then we need to have an infrastructure or something, right, that
Right.
comes into place that allows for us to continue to do this type of work. And
Yeah.
as we're facing all these unprecedented sort of concerns, I just was looking at my phone this morning, and there's a heat wave on your side of the country that's hitting, that's unprecedented, that hasn't happened in 100 years. And I don't think it's going to be the last one, right? And I don't think
No.
the next thing after that's going to be the fires
No.
when they come back. And so
No, exactly. So California's been,
we need
kind
to
of
think
like
about.
wave after wave
Right. So there's
of
this
things.
opportunity, and we know that we as makers can help to contribute to the
Yeah.
solutions for these things. But the question is, how do we get the government, everybody else
Yeah.
to kind of
Yeah.
come behind us and help us, right? Do this. We can do this. We've shown it. We've demonstrated. Look at, we got the receipts from
Right.
COVID. But now how do we go farther than that?
Yeah. No, I think that's great. And it's also, it was frustrating to see government giving out millions, if not billions of dollars to, industries that really weren't producing
Hmm.
solutions. And but I really think there's a different model here that, I've kind of used the word widely distributed but loosely coordinated, community efforts. Our governments tend to think of very centralized answers. And there is a need for some level of centralization, like funding, but to some degree, the way that groups spun up, and I know you and Sabrina and others have worked, trying to develop policy
Hmm.
to influence the next or the current administration in the U.S., but policy really around the world. I think that's kind of a thing we've sort of not necessarily. I've always felt I'm bad at thinking like that, so don't ask me about it. But it is important that we get these models, in a sense, reported, researched, and made more understandable to people like government officials and agencies and things like that.
Yeah, and that's why a lot of the efforts. So I know I will say and put in some plugs for some things that folks are working on. There's been work on makerspace scorecards, our annual survey of makerspaces, things that gather data. And I know sometimes it's hard, right? You're in the midst of doing stuff. You're like, I don't have time to gather data on what I'm doing. But the reality is that data does help, right? Like in terms of making the case for why this works. And I think sometimes we're up against big sort of companies and corporations for some funding or things like that, and they're like, oh, but these are the folks that just print out yodas. They're not serious. And so having data that shows what you're doing, whether it's workforce related, education related, whether it has to do with the pandemic and health response, whether it's disaster remediation, whatever you're doing, keep track of it as much as you can. And I think a lot of our corporate partners, there was some good great conversation about how we can help to gather this type of information and the interest in trying to get this information for our entire movement so that we are able to push it forward. Because I think some of it is making that compelling case. I also think one of the sessions I attended was around advocacy. It was mostly K-12 advocacy for making in sort of the learning context that Kid Museum put on. And it was really good. And Lemelson as well. And David Coronado from Lemelson was saying, we also need to tell these compelling stories that, funders, sometimes it's not either or. So I want you to collect data, I guess is the take home from that from everyone listening. But I also want that data not just to be quantitative. I do want you to gather those qualitative stories, because I think one of the things that's been really incredible is being able to share the stories from the pandemic. And so I can say something like, there's 48 million pieces of PPE, and people are like, whoa, 48 million pieces of PPE in this period of time. But then I can also tell the story of, Artisans Asylum, of, Something Labs, of all the stories that Dale just told, plus countless others. I can tell NWLA Makerspace, I can tell Open Work story, I can tell
Yeah.
all these different stories. And people are like, oh my gosh, in every single community, this was happening. I
Yeah.
can also tell, stories of sewing circles and, people that are just everyday individuals that made so many of one thing. I don't know how many grandmas I talked to that were
Yeah.
making. So I think that, some of it is really how do we need to, realize
Yeah.
that we take this moment and we become a bullhorn
Yeah.
and a bully pulpit ourselves to keep telling people what we've done.
Right. Kind of another point related to this is, and you kind of mentioned earlier, but maybe just missed it. the effort wasn't just individuals interacting with other individuals or maker to maker. It was also maker organization to maker organization, whether
Mhm.
it was makerspace to makerspace or I was trying to remember the one out of Providence that uh, the the public health doctor you worked with her on.
Oh, Megan Rainey.
Yes, Megan Rainey. Yeah, yeah, I couldn't remember, but it was great to see organizations that didn't know a whole lot about makers to begin with
Mhm.
suddenly get to know who we were, what we could do, and boy, they were as enthusiastic supporters of the community as you could ask for. So it's really those um, you know uh, creating those organizational alliances that
Yeah.
I think are really
It's those
important as
definite
well.
connections. Dr. Shikha Gupta, who's the head of Get SPB, has said to me countless times. She said, "I didn't know what a maker was before, and I'm ashamed." And I'm like, it's okay. You don't have to be ashamed of it. But she's like, now that I know what you guys can do, I want you to do everything. Like I can think of,
Yeah,
there's so many ways. And so now she's one of our advocates for, the maker movement because she's seen it firsthand. And I think that that's really, what we need to do. And I know there have been countless folks that we've talked to in economic development, going back,
yeah,
to the wonderful keynote that we had from Alana. Like, there are people that just don't know about these spaces, and
yeah,
once they find out what we're capable of doing, they're like, oh my gosh, you can do what,
yeah,
and they really see the promise. And I think some of it is just, I know you've been in media for most of your life, but it's like we almost need a better public relations
yeah,
campaign, or some sort of
yeah,
large scale marketing. And it's not necessarily the word, right? Like it's not make as in capital M, and it's not necessarily as a brand, but more as a understanding of what we're capable of doing. And I
yeah.
think you've been doing that a lot in terms of the podcast and the work that you've done. And I want to, you were so kind to say something nice about me. It's my turn to say something nice
No, no,
about
yeah,
you,
I know.
Dan. But
Let's move on.
it's not quid pro quo, but it's just
No,
saying that you've done an excellent
yeah,
job getting the word out to people, right?
yeah,
Who don't necessarily know, talking to community colleges and talking to educators and talking to all kinds of folks who may not understand what we do or who we are as a
yeah.
community. But I think we need to do more.
Yeah,
We
absolutely.
all need
Well,
to.
I think that the large point here is it isn't just about discussions within the community; it's also discussions outside of that. And I just want to acknowledge some of the comments that are coming into the chat that are really great. We may
Oh
get
yeah.
into them shortly, but it's a really good place to maybe start some of the discussions here, and we'll try to pick up on them. Uh, so at any rate, I think let one of I think I see some questions along this line is we didn't want to just use this session to talk about the COVID-19 response. We
Right.
really wanted to say it's time to move forward with that in our arsenal or in our backpack to move on. And I kind of, let's see if I can share here. I wanted to um, Dorothy, I sent this to Dorothy as a, um, let me get here. You should, this is, if you can see this, Eric Lander is the new director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, comes from the Broad Institute, which is sort of a organization. I think his background is in genetics. And but he used the framing in his talk for his swearing-in ceremony of Tikkun Olam, which is might be translated in English as repairing the world. And I just thought this was a really good, idea for our community. And I won't read it all to you, but it was really about maximizing the benefits of science and technology to advance the human condition, to improve the human condition, and that I'd say science and technology, when combined with humans that care and want to do this, that's his idea of applied with vision and wisdom and humility and integrity, that we can actually make positive change in the world. And the part I love the most is, importantly, we must continue to repair the world, even knowing that we will never perfect it. And still, every day, we must keep trying. So it's an obligation for us to try, and we without knowing that we will succeed at it or that we will, get where we really want to go. And I just I really enjoyed that framing that he used for this, and I thought it just fits so well with kind
Yeah.
of the underlying ethos of the maker movement.
Yeah, when Dale shared it with me, I agreed. I think that this is kind of what I always feel like deep down, like, it's in us, it's in our very DNA, like this is what we're meant to do as humans, like not even defining ourselves as a subclass of people called makers. I just think that every human has that feeling that like I need to make the world a better place. And I mean, obviously, Eric is Dr. Lander is coming from a genetics background, and I come from a science background. And in genetics, obviously, you believe in sort of the idea that there's Darwinism and that we're moving towards a better future, that we're more generations of folks as we go forward will continue to improve upon the human species. But even if you take it out of that context, and if you look at any, and this is not to be a religious talk, but any religion or any belief system, there's always a belief in doing better, even if you go to like Burning Man principles, right? Like of how do we make the world a better place around us. And so, I also like the end there that he says, the obligation is rooted in the words, it's not required that you complete the work, but neither may you refrain from it. And I think that that's the thing that's like that compelling, right? Like, of like, man, I have to do this. And I asked so many makers, right? Especially folks whose spaces were really struggling, like, why are you doing this? And they're like, well, why wouldn't we? Like literally, it was like the stupidest question I could ever ask. And, it's like, it just didn't make sense. Like somebody's suffering or somebody's having a hard time. Right. And I need to help them. Like, that's
Right.
just what I have to do. And I'm sorry, I'm getting slightly emotional because I do. Part of the reason why I do this work is because I feel so compelled towards it. And this really does, capture that feeling. And so I think that, I will say when Dale shared it with me, I had missed that this had been said in his swearing in, and I was excited because we haven't heard anything from OSTP to answer this
Exactly.
question. But I do feel like, okay, when he does come to us or somebody from the office does come to us, I have words that he used. Your boss says that we must repair the world. And guess who does that? That's the makers. That would be us. So we should have an office. So,
Yeah.
so the hope is that, we will be able to appeal to his sense of this feeling of knowing that we need to do this work, and to understand that part of what we do as
Right.
makers is
Yeah.
is going towards that. But no, I have not. So I, just in case anyone asks, I have
Yeah.
not heard anything yet.
Yeah. No. And I think it also puts us in mind of thinking the long view. That this is something, we have to do, even if there's not a short term, gain from it. We must believe that it matters, and we can push that forward. And obviously, Dorothy, the pandemic has almost created greater awareness of the problems that we have that need
Mhm.
repairing. That the world is
Yeah,
not just imperfect, but in ways broken, right? And
super
that
broken.
is, that's what we're called to kind of look at in a direct way, and deal with it as a reality, but also respond to it, and do something.
Mhm.
So I think that's kind of where what his
Yeah.
remarks made me think of.
I mean, looking at and even looking at the language he uses, and obviously he's trying to cross over all of science and technology given his position. But I think, you do think about it, and I often think about beyond COVID, beyond this particular health crisis, and thinking to things like climate change, right? And thinking to things like, natural disaster, but then also thinking towards things like social justice, right? And equality, and how we can actually make a difference, which I know I've talked to some people that are like, no, 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 that's not a maker thing. Like, somehow, but I don't think we're called to address just a subset of problems. I actually do think we're called to address all of the problems. Now, not every one of us is going to address every problem, right? And that goes back to that
And
skill
we
set,
can't.
right?
Yeah.
Right, you can't. So that's totally okay. But I do think that there need to be pockets of us that are addressing all of the different issues. And it may be, and I've thought about this a lot, a few years back at the first NomCon, we had the gathering of the humanitarian sort of groups and the makers, and we were sort of talking about, different kinds of disasters. And one of the ideas that came forth from Christopher Breedlove at Burning Man and Burners Without Borders was this idea of maker spaces as like disaster resiliency centers. And, the idea that kind of came out of that was, well, what if there were different places that specialized in sort of different types of disasters? So you could have a makerspace that had particular knowledge in fire, right? And maybe it actually is a place that's not close to a fire, so they wouldn't be hit by the fire, right? But then when the fires happen, that makerspace would jump into action and have the knowledge to kind of help out. And I think you could sort of expand that idea beyond just a space, right? So thinking about each of us having these different skill sets, well, what if we were to kind of work together and really think about what the ecosystem could look like? And are there specialty sort of groups that deal with certain things? Are there some of us, that are dealing with environmental issues? Are there some of us that are dealing more with, earth sustainability sorts of issues? Are there other ones of us that are specialists in education and go deeper in those areas? And can we use each other's knowledge, right, to have an impact all over the place, right? So it does, and what it means is that you could do so much more. And I'm always saying this, and you guys probably are rolling your eyes every time I say this, or maybe some of you, it's too early to have a shot, but maybe when it gets late at night, you guys are having shots every time I say this. But the more that we work together, the bigger the impact we can have, right? Because we don't have to be a master of all, right? But what we do have to do is try to take what we do have and give it to the world and give it to each other so that we can have that bigger impact. So I don't know. I'm always obsessed with sort of thinking about how we could do this like better together. Especially I think in our country right now, we're dealing with some really, really nasty issues around social justice, around how do we create reparative communities, how we restore economic stability to communities, all of these things that we know that the maker movement, although maybe not obvious to people, can help with, right? So how do we do that more intentionally, and how do we do that through the leadership of some of our organizations that are doing this work already so
Right.
wonderfully?
And I see Danielle put a link to, there's a Tikkun Olam Makers group, Tom
Yeah.
Global, tomglobal.org, that had, has started in Tel Aviv and has moved around the world and has done wonderful things also during this. So, maybe moving ahead, I think one of the ideas I had about thinking forward is that it's something like 10 to 15 years. There really is makers the next generation. That there are people that have either grown up doing things like Maker Faire, and now they like Karina. I think we is part of what the idea, I think, in Eric Lander's comment is that it won't be just you that's able to accomplish this. You have to almost think of the next generation, because they will. This is a tradition in a way that you will pass on, and they will pick up the work and carry it forward. It's almost the idea of like a European cathedral taking 3 generations to build. You can't do it yourself in your lifetime. So I think that sort of gets at I see a lot of young makers coming in and beginning to show us what they can do, assert their own leadership and direction, and I just want to celebrate that and anything we can do to foster that. And certainly that's why we believe education's important. That if we can give more people access to tools, materials, and kind of the mindset, they can pick this up and move it forward as well.
Well, and I think that that's one of the things that's actually interesting when you talk about Karina, and as you were talking about her, I think about how many like middle schoolers, elementary schoolers, were actually also working on solutions, right, during COVID. And I think that the reality is that, a lot of those kids were doing those things because of the prevalence of what the work that had been done in previous years, right? So, if you look back to when you started Maker Faire, those kids are in college now. Like those kids that
Yeah,
were going, if they were
absolutely.
babies or like toddling around, they're in college now or older. And so, there, and it's kind of funny because you talk to college students, and I've talked to a few people that are looking at colleges, and they're like, I'm looking at how many maker spaces are at each college. And,
Yeah,
you and I have had conversations about the universities and how now it's rare to find a university that doesn't have a makerspace because that's something that students are looking for in their decision making. And so that's,
yeah,
because they want those different tools, and so I think that, there is this, there is this sort of growing desire to use these tools and technologies to make a difference. I think this generation also, I do feel hopeful about this generation. They do want to change things. They don't seem to think that we screwed things up that badly, or they do, but they're
maybe
like,
they
we'll
do.
fix, but they're like, we'll fix it, which I'm like, you guys are so great. I hope you
Yeah,
can, because we really
yeah,
mess things up. But
yeah,
but I think that, there is this hope, for that,
right.
um,
And the goal is to empower them,
right.
to do what they want to do,
Yeah.
and their view of the world. So,
Yeah, I want to
um,
quickly acknowledge in the chat, a few people are, talking about, how the maker movement obviously does predate we have the maker
absolutely,
movement that we have, and it is absolutely true. And I think that, there are also lots of people like we saw in this pandemic that don't consider themselves makers, but certainly are. And it's not like, some of them decided to call themselves makers afterwards, and some of them actually didn't, and they're like, I don't really care to be part of this movement, I just wanted to help people, and that's totally fine. So I think we'll continue to see that. I think it's more about the tools and mindset, and that's, sort of what you just remarked upon, Dale, which is like, giving as many people the knowledge that they need to have the solutions, right?
yeah,
And it's just expanding your tool belt, right? So you have this tool belt and you have some tools, and then every so often you get to go into like Harbor Freight or wherever, and you buy some more tools, and you're like, now I can make some different things because I got some new tools. And so
yeah,
that's kind of the way I look at this, is that, we're trying to give these young people the opportunity to solve problems that we haven't even figured out yet. I mean, the thing that was
yeah,
so scary about that pandemic was that we you could argue some people saw it coming, but many of us did not see it coming. Many of us could not predict that this would happen. Now there are people that did predict it, but there are most of us people walking around did not think that this was going to happen.
yeah,
And
yeah,
and so I can't even imagine what our kids are going to have to come up with solutions to, but we want to make sure they're
yeah,
ready for that.
yeah. One of the things that I think is kind of interesting when talking about like higher ed and seeing, the development of maker spaces as an amenity in a way for university campuses, but also as a reality. I was thinking of meeting over the last year. People run the Beam Lab, which is Be a Maker at University of North Carolina. That one of the reasons the provost of the university was interested in it is they saw it as a place to bring people together from
Mm-hmm.
different disciplines and to work on projects that students had in mind. And you might be in there and run into a medical student or a business student or a chemist or any of these things, and they could really that sort of recombinant innovation idea. But interestingly, I think they succeeded at this, but they were putting maker spaces into dorms.
Mm-hmm.
They had these kind of um, social spaces that weren't being used. They used to have TVs in them, and nobody goes to watch TV in that way. And they were building out maker spaces, and we're finding the students were really interested in that. So, really. So I think one of the things we have seen in education in the past, but um, you know, I was talking to Tom Igo a little bit of ITP and how things that graduate students could do, or that model of learning in graduate school is often like, well, you have to do a project. You have to do your research. You have to learn to do that. Whereas in lower levels of education, the teacher tells you what to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're seeing through the maker thing that these models that are in grad school and the tools they have access to, but more importantly, the thinking is beginning to move down, slowly to secondary ed and then, into middle schools. And I think that's a real important force for us to think about is, that too much of it, K-12 education is we've got to teach them this,
Mm-hmm.
and it's content rather than here are the experiences that and empower them to think for themselves and to go forward. So I think that coupled with the idea of the next generation, it's kind of how you. My hope is in the post-COVID approach that school maker spaces which were closed will reopen. That there'll be almost a new, reinvigorated interest in hands-on learning and these kind of important experiences for kids.
Yeah.
And we still have a long, long way to go there. As sometimes I'm proud that we have maker spaces in so many places that I never thought they would, but there's so much more to do there. Does every kid get in that maker space? Do they have a program in that maker space?
Mm-hmm.
Are those maker spaces in schools where marginalized communities live? So it's just there's so much more that we need to do there.
Yeah, and I think there's a few comments in here around, our trying to use experiences to bring community together that we don't make in isolation often, right?
Right.
Like we think of it and we're like, oh, you have this tool and you're by yourself sort of in your garage, but the reality is that, and we saw this during COVID, right? Is this idea of going back to kind of how do we organize around our community? How do we organize, like again, what we can do as the nation of makers is very different than what one individual can do. And it's not to diminish what individual can do, it's just to say that you get this exponential effect. And the reality is that historically has been how we've learned. Like if you think about it, there used to be apprenticeships, right? Like real apprenticeships before the Department of Labor apprenticeships. There were actually apprenticeships where someone would take someone under their belt and say, I'm going to teach you how to become a woodworker. I'm going to teach you, I really like hanging out with you. I'm going to teach you how to do this. Or, it's the kid who came after school to, somebody's wood shop and then learned how to become a woodworker. And we don't see that as much, right? We don't, we don't see that type of learning happening. Instead, it's very much sage on the stage, the way that, we just talked about this sort of top down, this is what you can and can't do. And even some of our maker spaces, you're absolutely right. The delivery of education is not exactly what you would like, right? Because don't touch anything, I'm going to show you, and you can only use this kit in this one way. Versus the more open exploration. And obviously, there's reasons for that in terms of liability, all kinds of other issues. But I think there is room for experiential learning, especially
Yeah.
given all these different problems. And I do think there's a lot of promising programs that are using real challenges. And, I'm not some of the challenges, it's hard, there's a lot of challenge programs out there. And sometimes you get challenge fatigue. But I do think that challenges can be used for real life challenges. There's so many of them around there, and understanding how we can respond to challenges helps us in situations like the one, this is not a drill. COVID-19 was not a drill. We just went into
Yeah.
challenge mode and started iterating. So,
Yeah. Um, Dorothy, I'm going to share my screen and show. This is kind of a. Let me go to. This is a. I did a podcast with Nathan Pritchett of Fab Lab Tulsa, and and he has this pyramid which they've used to explain to other people, and it's talking about growing the community. It was really growing the ecosystem, and you can kind of see, at the bottom, they reach 12,000 people through events like Maker Faire and outreach programs. They have an education effort where students come to the makerspace or they go out to schools, reaching 4,800. They have 425 members. 45 people are involved in a workforce development, and 35 new businesses have started there. And his point, which I really liked for us to think about, is when he was talking to like funders and others, and they'd say, "Hey, how do we get more people in workforce development?" one of his responses is we have to grow the whole community, not just that segment. Like that segment will grow if we grow the whole community. And I think that's a really nice holistic view of what makerspaces can try to do, particularly at the community level. But you know, we sometimes just look at, oh, how do we market to get new members? But those outreach efforts are really important. And kind of, I'm going to close, at least want to mention this paper. Oop, I have a misspelling in that. Excuse me. Organizing around experiences. I met this week with Andrea Gorbatai, who's at the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley. She is a sociologist who studies things, but she just published this paper earlier this year called Making Space for Emotions, Empathy, Contagion, and Legitimacy's Double-Edged Sword. She actually used the maker community as a case study. She went to Harvard and to get her PhD, and she lived near Artisans Asylum. And she's initially, I think she was a neighbor of Guy's, and 2011, 12, something like that. And that was her first connection with the maker community. And as she came out to the Bay Area and at Berkeley, she began to see maker fairs. And what she was kind of writing about was how there's when a new field, she used that word, emerges, there's a small core of people that kind of almost define that field, that are their energy, their ideas form that. And then as it becomes more legitimate, or she calls it legitimation, a process where more people recognize it and value it, the community begins to grow. And this double-edged sword is often in communities that begin to grow, where the core was coherent, the growth makes it incoherent. The growth makes it sort of a little bit of everything to everybody, and there's nothing there. But she wrote about how Maker Faire, and this is what I wanted to talk to her, really gave people an experience to build around, an emotion that they shared, and it allowed them to feel a part of the community and to connect the words they use to tell their own stories to the words that other people use. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was a really interesting idea. In other words, maker is not like a checkbox. Like if you're a teacher, you belong to a teacher association because you're a teacher, or you're a medical doctor, or your alumni association because you graduated from a school. And to some degree, the maker communities organize these common experiences or shared experiences. And often it's about what we feel about ourselves and others and so she was talking about that as, a way to solve for this idea of inclusion exclusion, that some communities end up being defined by their exclusion and others defined by their inclusion. And so she's saying, if we can give these experiences to lots of people and they feel a part of this community, that's a really good model for inclusion. So I kind of wanted to share that idea.
Share the link with our
yes. It's behind one of these paywall scientific business servers, so it's a little bit hard. But I'm gonna have a podcast on her my interview like in the next week or two, and if you just follow our site, we'll have a link to what I can do there.
Awesome.
Even that. So.
Anyway, well, I know we're coming up on the hour, and unfortunately, I could talk to you forever about this. And I think there's so much that was put in the chat that I feel very, very badly that we didn't get to everything. But I think the point of this conversation is just for us to sort of, NomCon is always a start to a conversation. The goal of NomCon is not for you to go home and to just
resume your normal day.
Actually, we want you not to resume your normal activities. We want you to do way more, right? And each year we come together trying to think about what's the new thing we're going to do this year and how are we going to make a difference. And last year we didn't need any help to tell us what we had to do because we were just doing it. And you guys were so tired last year. Everyone was like, I don't have time to go to NomCon.
Yeah.
But you came. But I think now that we have a little time to reflect from what we've done, and I know where some of us are still very exhausted and still doing this work very deeply, I think there is a moment in time for us to think about how we can pivot. And a few of you did talk about in the chat pivoting and sort of as you open your spaces back up, thinking about how they could be even better used within your community and what other connections we can make, what other experiences we all share, not
Yeah.
just as makers, but as humans in our communities, and how we can solve some of those big problems that are nasty problems that we all have, that we're trying to work through together. So whether it be climate change, whether it be social injustice, whether it be, sustainability, economic development, recovery, resilience, whatever you name it, we have solutions, but how can we facilitate those? And I saw Sarah in there, who's the head of our library space, putting in a plug for libraries because they are publicly accessible, open, to the public, amazing spaces that are trying to do a lot of this work.
Yeah.
And a lot of our public libraries now do have maker spaces, so I'm very excited about that because it does allow
Absolutely.
access
I
to.
always feel like they were the first to show up and they'll
Yeah,
probably be the last to leave.
exactly. And so I'm just very excited about that. But I think the idea is that, just really thinking about what we can do going forward. So I hope this did inspire you. I saw Sarah's note just
Yeah.
pop up. I
Yeah.
feel so inspired. We will, Rebecca just said something about needing more resources. So we definitely will put some resources into the notes on how to do this. We are working, if you're interested in advocacy work, our advocacy group is trying to create a user's guide for how do you have these conversations with people, how do you pull in different stakeholders. This work is very active and you can be a part of it. So if you have
Yeah.
questions, let us know so that we actually can help address those questions. And I know, as I said, this is bigger than any one of our organizations. So Dale and I are excited to work together. I know Sherry Lassiter at Fab Foundation, we've had these conversations. Other organizations, Ticonola Makers actually is part of a group that I'm part of, and the Nation of Makers is part of as well. So we've been having this conversation internationally even. So I think there is a lot of things that we can do
Yeah.
going forward.
Yeah.
And so I want to thank you, and I'll let Dale. I don't
Yeah.
want to cut
No,
him off.
that's a great wrap up. I'll stop there. But just to say, I think more of these conversations we can have in small groups across organizations, across geographic locations. Um, Please, I'd like to hear from people. I put my email in there if you have specific ideas. But I'm really focused a lot on how can we tell stories about what people are doing. I don't know if it gets out to everybody. Nothing does in some ways, but you still have to work at it. But I'd love to hear about what you're doing and ideas for what all of us can do together. So there's plenty to do, and we just have to get to work.
Definitely. Thank you so much for joining us, Dale.